Good morning and welcome to the fourth and final day of APAC's Legislative Leadership Summit. I'm Madeline Milka, President and CEO of APAC's, the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. Thank you for joining us as we explore our next topic of discussion, diversity in clinical trials and health outcomes. I'd also like to thank our event partners, PhRMA, Biogen, and DataRobot for sponsoring this panel. For all of those participating as part of the Summit platform, I highly recommend taking a look at the exhibitor booths for downloadable material from our event sponsors. And thank you to all of them for sponsoring this Legislative Leadership Summit. Before we begin, it is my pleasure to invite co-chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus Healthcare Task Force, Congressman Ami Bera, for opening remarks. Congressman Bera currently represents the 7th District of California, and prior to serving in Congress, had a 20-year medical career where he worked to deliver care to thousands of Sacramento residents. He is the longest serving Indian American in Congress and a champion for the Asian American community. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Ami Bera.
Madeline, thank you for that generous introduction. And again, thank you for your leadership and all the work that APAC does. This is an incredibly important topic, certainly in the midst of this pandemic. If I put my doctor and academic medicine hat on, often when you look at clinical trials, you're getting a homogeneous population and you don't have that diversity. And unless you go into communities and have a diverse representation that's reflective of the overall population, you may get findings that may work for one population of folks and certainly not another. And certainly in the design around the clinical trials of COVID-19 vaccines and such, that is a point that we emphasized as members of CAPAC and the Congressional Asian Pacific Islander Caucus, that we wanted these trials to be inclusive. It's also a point that we've been emphasizing to the administration. And while this isn't clinical trials, some of it's about health equity. And as we're going into the second phase of vaccinating a domestic population here, we want to make sure that materials are not just in English and Spanish, or even if some of the Asian languages are included. We're not a monolithic community, so it's not just Chinese or Hindi languages. It's also putting materials in multiple languages, and then also partnering with organizations and communities. So I do think there's an opportunity as we build a public health infrastructure to defeat COVID-19 and partner with trusted organizations within the API community. If we can do that in a lasting way, then we can also have those organizations partner with us when we think about diversity in clinical trials and academic trials, where they can help recruit folks to come in. So again, Madeline, thank you for your leadership and APAC for putting this event on. I think it's an incredibly important topic. And I looked at the folks on your panel, and I think you've got a great panel of experts. And again, thank you for doing this. CAPAC is always here to help you. So with that, again, thank you for everything. Be well and be safe.
Thank you, Congressman Bera. We appreciate all of your leadership and expertise on this subject. It's now my privilege to introduce Irene Bueno, co-founder of NVG. Ms. Bueno has decades of experience working in and with the highest levels of government. She served in the Clinton administration as special assistant to the president in the White House Chief of Staff's office and Domestic Policy Council, and as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Legislation at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. A leader in the National Asian Pacific Islander American community, she serves on the Asian American Justice Center's National Advisory Council, Asian American Action Fund Board, and previously served on the APEX board. So Irene, I turn it over to you. Irene, unfortunately, I think you are on mute.
Okay, thank you so much,
there you
Madeline.
Go. Here you now.
Great, so great to be here, and thank you for inviting me to moderate this amazing panel of experts. So let's get to it. This is a very important topic, and I want to start off first by introducing our distinguished panelists. So let me first start off with Behtash Bahador, who is an associate director at the nonprofit organization CISCRP and holds a Master of Science in Health Communication from Tufts University School of Medicine. Since 2014, he has collaborated with a range of stakeholder groups to establish and implement patient and public-centric initiatives across the life cycle of drug and treatment development. This has included supporting the development of regulatory and cross-disciplinary best practice guidelines, operationalizing key elements of evidence-based public health programming into research engagement activities, and always keeping the needs of patients, participants, and the public at the forefront of his work. So welcome, Behtash. Next, I'd like to introduce Carolyn Ha, who is a senior director in the Policy and Research Department at PhRMA, where she provides clinical expertise to shape policy development and advocacy related to population health and chronic disease management, improvement of medication use, and clinical quality strategies. As a clinician, she is passionate about improving patient care and health outcomes and translating research into actionable policies that will ensure patients get the most out of their medications and creating an equitable healthcare delivery system that incentivizes innovation. Carolyn received her Doctor of Pharmacy from Rutgers University and is a registered pharmacist in Virginia. Prior to joining PhRMA, she spent time as a practitioner in a community pharmacy and advocated on behalf of independent pharmacy owners. Next, I'd like to introduce Helen Huang, who is the Director of Clinical Operations Program Lead at Biogen. Ellen has over 20 years of experience in clinical research. She has held multiple roles within clinical research and worked across many therapeutic areas, including multiple sclerosis and Alzheimer's disease. At Biogen, Ellen leads program level clinical operation strategy in a number of assets with the neurodegeneration development unit. As part of the program level clinical operation strategy, she ensures that the strategies around enrollment of underserved and unrepresented patient populations are incorporated in clinical development plan. Ellen received her Doctor of Pharmacy degree from the University of Michigan. Welcome, Ellen. Next, we have Haniyeh, who is a global AI ethicist at DataRobot's trusted AI team. Her research focuses on bias, privacy, robustness, and stability, and ethics in AI and machine learning. She has demonstrated history of implementing ML and AI in a variety of industries and initiated the incorporation of bias and fairness feature into the DataRobot product. She's a thought leader in the area of AI bias and ethical AI. Haniyeh holds a PhD in astronomy and astrophysics from, and I know I'll get this wrong, Rheinische Friedrich Wilhelms Universität Bonn. So thank you, Haniyeh. And then last but not least, we have LaTasha Lee. Dr. Lee is responsible for oversight and implementation of research projects and programs focused on reducing patient risk and identifying optimal care to reduce health disparities and to bring about health equity. She also provides input into the overall strategy for research participants, partnerships, and health equity research at the National Minority Quality Forum, or NMQF. Tasha is working on several projects focused on disproportionate COVID-19 rates and outcomes of individuals in communities of color and diversity in clinical research. Prior to joining NMQF, LaTasha was a senior manager of partnership engagement at Sickle Cell Disease Clinical Trials Network at the ASH Research Collaborative. In her prior role at the ASH Research Collaborative, Tasha was the senior manager of sickle cell policy and programs at the Association of Hematologists, or ASH, where she was responsible for the day-to-day management and implementation of projects, programs, and activities related to ASH's call to action on sickle cell disease. A knowledgeable and skilled and energetic scientist and public policy advisor with Capitol Hill experience, Dr. Lee has worked very closely with Congress and federal agencies to monitor biomedical research and access care, policy related to various diseases impacting communities of color. She earned her PhD in integrated biology with a concentration in neuroscience from Florida Atlantic University, an MPH in epidemiology from the George Washington University, and a bachelor's in biology from Florida A&M University. Dr. Lee is an adjunct assistant professor at GW School of Medicine and Health Sciences and the recipients of numerous awards, including the 2018 National Minority Quality Forum 40 Under 40 Leaders in Minority Health, Congressional Black Caucus Brain Trust Staff Leadership Award in recognition of efforts to end health disparities, and the Distinguished Alumni Award from the Florida Atlantic University. So please join me in giving a virtual welcome to all of our panelists today. Right. So today, we would like to start off by reminding audience members that we will have a Q&A section to ask questions. So if you want to ask any questions and answers, please use the Q&A function. So let me first start off with Behtash. I'm going to start with you first, so I'll give you that heads up. Can you tell us, why is there a need for more diverse clinical trials and medical publications?
Sure, and thank you so much, both for the introduction and for the opportunity to be on this distinguished panel. Obviously, very, very important topic that we're addressing here, specific to this population, but for all populations, the diversity is a topic that has come to the forefront, both as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, in terms of medical research, but also, issues of racial inequality and racial injustice have also come to the forefront over the last couple of years due to, continued horrible events that take place. So as a result, there's much greater spotlight on this, and it's an opportunity for us to highlight why this is so important to address. And so, first and foremost, as the Congressman mentioned earlier, without diverse representation in clinical research, we have less of an understanding, or a lack of understanding altogether, of the effectiveness and safety of treatments for those specific populations. And so this has been historically an issue in clinical research for years, for a number of different reasons that I'm sure we'll touch on today. But it has begun to improve, and so that's probably the number one issue, is making sure that we know that the medicines that are being developed, the treatments that are being developed, therapies, vaccines, preventative measures included, these are effective for the audiences, and not just biologically, but also based on their lived experiences. The biologics is obviously very important and a huge focus in clinical research, but we know that everybody's barriers to better health are different based on the socioeconomic circumstances that their particular population faces. So ensuring that we have better representation in research and better medical publication on that, better research that's out there, so other researchers can be informed, is of course critically important.
Thank you, Behtash. Carolyn, the same question.
Hi, Irene. Just want to make sure folks can hear me and say good afternoon. And I did want to also extend a thank you to APACS and Madeline for the invitation to be on this panel and to have this really important discussion. And PhRMA is pleased to be a part of this. For those of you who aren't familiar, PhRMA is a voluntary nonprofit organization representing the nation's leading innovative biopharmaceutical companies, including Ellen and Biogen, who's also on the panel with us today. Our members are dedicated and devoted to discovering and developing medicines that enable all patients to live longer, more productive and healthier lives. So the question posed is such a great one, because for our industry, our why is about addressing health inequities and ensuring that underrepresented populations are seen and heard, and their voices and experiences are critical to informing how we develop our medications. Having diverse populations ensures that we have medications that can treat all of us. And, I do also want to stress that as we look into the future and the pipeline, more and more medications are now being developed on a personalized medicine, level down to our genetics. And so that is why it's ever more critical now that we have these representative populations that are available for us to study and to treat the populations that they're intended to cure. And I would say from a clinician standpoint, the medical publications piece is so critical to helping all of us become better patient care providers and patient advocates. When clinicians see a patient that may not look like kind of that prototypical patient that was used in a clinical trial setting, but out in the real world, we want them to be able to access the latest literature and data to help them be a more empathetic provider, really listen to their patients. I've had patients come in and say, this particular medication doesn't work for me, even though I have this condition. And, we would hope that there is more diversity in these trials so that we have better data to inform those treatment decisions and conversations with our patients. So, again, just want to applaud APACS for having this really important conversation and look forward to delving into the panel discussion a little bit later on as well.
Okay, thank you so much. Ellen, same question for you.
Thanks. Well, I would also first like to thank APACS for the invitation and just to continue to what Caroline has provided. So recognizing that the results of clinical trials and subsequent publications may influence the standard of healthcare and delivery. Diversity in clinical trial population is critical to the public health and well-being of our population. And because the differences in people can lead to different responses to the same treatment, it is essential that the makeup of that clinical trial reflect the real-world population so that the medications are tested for all who may need them and prescribers have evidence-based data in the population that they treat. And lastly, publications of the clinical trials need to include analysis of the differences or the similarities in race or ethnicity and in other factors that may influence health outcomes, like what Behtash has noted, so poverty, geography, gender. And when these analyses are included in medical publications, then they become available as part of the base for evidence-based medicine advocates and policymakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Now I'd like to ask Haniyeh the same question.
Sure. First, I would like to thank APACS for kind of having this panel with this great distinguished panelists here. I would say that, as other panelists pointed out, the drugs can differentially affect different groups, especially when it comes to groups with underlying health conditions. So it's very important when we are having these trials for treatment or even for a medical product, the trial would represents the patients who are going to receive these treatments or going to use these medical products. So we would have the knowledge around safety, the knowledge around the side effects, and how effective this treatment would be. And we cannot do that without having a diverse trial and enrollment system. However, unfortunately, in the trials that's been going on over the years, we've seen that the trials lack the diversity and the representation of people of color doesn't match the overall population. So, and this is especially true when it comes to Asian American communities, and their representation in these trials is really a key for us to be able to reduce the health disparities that we have in the US.
Great. Thank you so much. And last but not least, LaTasha.
Thank you so much, Irene. And I really want to thank the APEX group for allowing me to present today and to discuss, some of the challenges that communities of color, in particular the Asian and Pacific Islander community, face in participation in clinical trials. For those of you who do not know, the National Minority Quality Forum is really big on data, and so we always look at the numbers. And I want to start by sharing some thoughts around the census, which really permitted us to have a peek at our nation's changing racial and ethnic diversity. And it really presents a snapshot of the composition of the United States, both now and in the future. When you look at the racial and ethnic group distribution nationally, it really shows that while non-Hispanic whites are alone still the numerical population with the largest representation in the United States, is also growing at the slowest rate. And so when you think about clinical trials, there's a great need for diversity. And so the inclusion of minority participants in clinical trials really gets down to why we need that. We need them to understand the differences in clinical outcomes. We need to understand the differences in pharmacokinetics between racial and ethnic groups, which in turn helps us to address healthcare disparities by age, race, gender, and ethnicity. However, the current system in representation of ethnic minorities is making some improvement. It needs a lot of work. And I really want to focus just a tiny bit on the pharmacogenetic research, which in the last several decades has gained a lot of attention because it's uncovered a number of significant differences among racial and ethnic minorities in the metabolism, the clinical effectiveness, the side effect profiles that many of our other panelists have highlighted, and why it's important to have these groups represented in clinical trials, because it's not only the treatment and its impact on those communities, but it also is a system level issue, because these differences must be taken to account when we're looking at the design of cost management policies, formulary implementation, therapeutic substitution regimens, step care protocols, et cetera. And we must highlight that these programs need to be broad and flexible enough to allow for these differences by racial and ethnic groups. And since we are here talking about the Asian Pacific Islander community, I'm a neuroscientist, so one of the things that we learned early in school is that a lot of the psychotropic drugs like antidepressants have a different regimen in Asian populations because they actually need to receive lower dosages compared to their white counterparts. So it's really important for us to understand these differences in clinical trials, and that's why we need more diverse clinical trials and medical publications that highlight these differences. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Tasha. I think so this answers to your first question laid out why it's so important that we have diversity in clinical trials. So I'll ask each of you, starting with Haniyeh, what are your organizations doing to promote more diversity in clinical trials and clinical research?
So DataRobot, our kind of foundation is about artificial intelligence and AI. How we can use the data to get insights and to understand different patterns that we have seen in the data. So when, with regards to COVID-19, DataRobot created forecasts that help manufacturers in two main ways. The first was the forecast enabled manufacturers to enroll the right people. And second, we were able to recommend them the site locations. And both of these factors was helpful in a sense that both made the trial more accessible, as well as by diversifying the locations and bringing the right participants, we actually managed to diversify the pool of participants in these trials. And as other panelists mentioned in the previous question, historically, 80–90% of trials would have white participants in them. However, when we worked with the manufacturers, we helped them define strategies that would maximize the diversity with regards to race and ethnicity. And in one case, we were able to significantly increase the number of participants from minority communities into the trial. And I should mention that this didn't come at the cost of reducing and slowing down the overall time for the trial. FDA also had dictated to the manufacturers that they should change their strategies when it comes to recruitment and have a more diverse trial when it came to COVID-19 vaccine. And to give you more details around what we did exactly was, our forecast enabled us to identify communities and locations that would be hit hard by the pandemic during the trial period. So the manufacturers would be able to have the sites in specific place, and the participation enrollment was conducted based on the future risk factors for infection, the mobility, and other factors at the census block level. So we had a granular level of information that could be used in order to both create a more accessible and more available sites, as well as increasing the diversity. And the whole process ended up resulting in a significantly faster trial period for the manufacturers.
Okay, thank you so much for giving us that example. Behtash, same question?
Sure. So for folks that maybe aren't aware of the organization that I'm with, it's CISCRP, which stands for the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation. It's quite a mouthful, and that's why we just say CISCRP. But we are an independent nonprofit, and since 2003, we've been working with pharma companies, industry, as well as patient advocacy groups, members of the public, and several different other types of agencies, public and private, to improve the experiences that participants have in clinical research, to raise the awareness among the general public about the importance of clinical research and importance of participating in clinical research. So to that end, one of the key areas that we work in is that awareness piece, developing general educational materials about clinical research, but also developing materials that target some of those underrepresented populations in clinical research. Now, again, over the last couple of years, us too, we've taken a look at ourselves and the materials we have and decided we don't have enough. And so, our materials, particularly for the Asian American Pacific Islander population, are limited. And so we are working on developing those materials. And importantly, when we do that type of work, the awareness and general education, and this also leaks a little bit into recruitment, these materials need to address the population-specific barriers, beliefs, perceptions that are out there. So very much so, we need to take a public health approach in first doing the research to understand what prevents this population from being in clinical trials. And sometimes, that very much also falls on the side of researchers and research sites in their own recruitment activities and recruitment goals. I think it was touched on, though, that is improving, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that related to COVID-19. But really quickly, I think, diversity goes beyond just the study population, right? And so in developing materials, another important activity is, collaboration and partnership with the community. I think, the community can be involved in an advisory capacity. That's something else that CISCRP does, pulling together patient advisory boards to help researchers design their protocols, design their recruitment activities. And the same thing goes for community organizations that service the community, as well as providers. We know that these are trusted places of information and care, HCPs and some of these community organizations, and so they also need to be more aware of clinical research and the importance of being involved in clinical research. So I think hopefully that helps address the question of what we do and what researchers in general are trying to do better in terms of creating diversity. Also, actually, I'll mention right before I finish, the diversity of researchers themselves is also important. And I think that's been highlighted in some of the COVID-19 PSAs we see. So, again, it's not just representation in trials, it's also involvement and having, I believe it was Carolyn said, having voices heard, in the actual design and carrying out of the research as well.
Okay. Thank you so much, Behtash. Same question for LaTasha.
Sure. So I'm going to start by giving people also, like several of the other panelists have done, an overview of the NMQF, my organization, and then give a few examples of what we do to really address clinical trial diversity. So the National Minority Quality Forum, or NMQF, is a nonprofit DC-based organization founded in 1998 to address the critical need for strengthening both national and local efforts to utilize evidence-based, data-driven initiatives and guide programs to eliminate disproportionate burden of premature death, as well as preventable illness in racial and ethnic minorities and other special populations. In the clinical trial space, we've done a number of things. We launched an effort called the I'm In campaign to really highlight the need for clinical trial diversity, along with several sponsors, pharmaceutical companies in this space. We will be doing a relaunch of that program shortly, but one of the things we also have, which we're really well known for, is GARI. So it's a proprietary web-based geomapping and advanced research information system, which accesses over 5 billion patient records to power what we call our collaborative learning communities, or disease indices, which looks at claims, related medical data, analytics that can be utilized for academic research, patient outcomes research, advocacy, as well as for clinical commercial operation applications. These multiple years of patient, provider, diagnostic, prescription, and other data is really granular, and we can look down at specific geolocations to create customized queries to understand where these patient populations reside. Because unfortunately, we know lots of clinical trials take place at large, major academic medical centers, but when you look at specific racial and ethnic groups, those may not be where they are actually seen in specific demographics. So that's one example, and we have these disease indices across many different disease areas. The other thing that we launched, and I think Irene mentioned it briefly in my intro, was a study that I'm managing called the Minority and Rural Coronavirus Insights Study. And this is looking at the impact of COVID-19 over a longitudinal 5-year study to understand the impact that COVID is having in specific communities, but also communities of color. And so we will be following many of these individuals over a 5-year period, looking at the impact that long haulers are experiencing, the impact of the disease, vaccination, antibodies, et cetera, in various communities, because there's a lot that we may not know about COVID-19, and especially now that individuals are being vaccinated, are there going to be any racial, ethnic differences in the vaccine titers? And then the last thing I want to mention is we talked about these various learning communities, and many of our learning communities put out publications. And for those of you really interested in cancer care disparities, our cancer working group published late last year the development of an actionable framework to address cancer care disparities in medically underserved populations in the US, which is an expert roundtable recommendation that was published in the American Society of Clinical Oncology's Journal of Oncology Practice. And the purpose of that article really was to serve as a toolkit to bolster healthcare and community stakeholder efforts, really to inform clinical research. And while the impetus of the paper was on cancer health equity, the current COVID-19 pandemic really highlights the need for this work across many efforts of health and healthcare. And it really is our hope that this framework will be used to inform and evaluate approaches to really make equity a reality where we each live, work, play, and pray. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, LaTasha. Carolyn?
Yeah, thank you so much, Irene, and really inspired already by all the other panelists sharing what their groups have been doing. And, you know, it really will take a village. It will take collaboration across all of us on the panel today and more. But, you know, from Pharmas Corner, you know, as I mentioned, we are a trade organization. We're a policy-focused organization. We're not necessarily, you know, one company. So, but, you know, as the collective voice for these innovative biopharmaceutical companies, we really decided that we can use our platform and our standing, to work with policymakers to decide what it is that we stand for when it comes to advocating for clinical trial diversity. The CEOs of those 30 companies and, who are our bosses and make up our board, they really challenged us. They challenged us to come together and collectively, as an industry, say we can and must take a more active role in advocating for clinical trial diversity. And so as kind of the standard bearer for, our companies, lead by example, right? I think a lot of our companies, Biogen included and others, they are doing amazing things. And we decided to put forth a set of voluntary clinical trial diversity principles that the industry can coalesce around. And we just released those about a month ago. So, from a really high level, what we're able to share is we need to start by acknowledging the past and the wrongs that have occurred. We cannot move forward without acknowledging that there have been some some dark histories, with several underrepresented populations, the Black and Brown and Asian and many other communities that have been underrepresented. And so first we need to start by acknowledging that there's more we can do, by learning from what we did wrong in the past. And so we are committed to enhancing diversity, including amongst the clinical investigators, the researchers, the scientists, to again, start to rebuild that trust. As Behtash talked about, representation, on the bench is also important. Representation as we outreach to these communities to help us recruit for patients. So, that's the first piece is acknowledging, the past so we can move forward. The second piece of our clinical trial diversity principles is really reducing any access barriers to clinical trial access. As LaTasha noted from her research as well, it's really, I think, important as we think about how we're going to design these new protocols to incorporate and think about these social determinants of health that are in the way of being able to actively recruit more diverse populations. So we are thinking about that. We certainly encourage our companies to start integrating that early on in the process when they're designing these protocols, how they're collecting their data surveys, thinking about, broadband, internet. Again, that was another barrier that we've learned about during COVID, and not even being able to access appointments if you don't have internet. So there are a lot of other things that factor into, a person's health that just go beyond just kind of this very clinical trial setting. And so again, as part of our principles, we're thinking much more broadly about reducing those access barriers to clinical trials. And then the last piece is really learning from real world data to enhance our understanding of diverse populations, as LaTasha talked about, beyond just product development in that post-marketing surveillance period. So I think these principles taken together is a huge step for us as an industry to say, these are the things that we stand for, and collectively as an industry, we know that there's much more we can do. And this is just the beginning, but happy to share that, again, we signed off on those principles about a month ago. So this is a very timely conversation for us to be a part of.
Great. Thank you so much, Carolyn. Next, Helen, any question?
Hi. Yes. So Biogen is committed to health equity. As a biopharmaceutical company pioneering in neuroscience, we have established a health equity ecosystem that includes internal platform, industry partnerships, and collaborations with the advocacy and nonprofit organizations focused on education and outreach within underrepresented patient population. The overall strategy is supported by 5 health equity strategic pillars, and they include patient engagement and education, increased representation in clinical trials, medical publication and engagement of key medical experts, telling the story internally and externally, and access. And so first of all, to understand the barriers in joining clinical trials, we have collaborated and conducted a study with the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development, and working closely with Tufts CSCD and Behtash's group, CISCRP, the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation, the team listened to and learned from patients, physicians, experts, and local community members about what it takes to remove the barriers patients face in joining clinical trials. And then to drive awareness and diversity in clinical trials, we continue to build trust and relationship in the community where we engage in clinical trials. So in diseases areas like lupus, multiple sclerosis, ALS, and Alzheimer's. And we do it through development of honest and transparent educational materials for patients and healthcare providers. And then with those trusted partners, we continue to engage with the community to build sustained commitment with the local leaders. Be virtual engagements during these times, of course, like this. And finally, supplementing and enhancing these efforts is the health equity, home healthcare provider, market research, and advisory boards. This is to tie back to our strategy and to map back to the areas of focus of our health equity team. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen, and to all the panelists for answering that question. I want to start off with Behtash next on a new question. How have diverse vaccine trials and medical research contributed positively toward the COVID-19 federal response? Behtash?
Sure. Yeah, obviously a very important question, right? A very important part of the response to COVID-19 has been the relative success of having diversity in the trials that were done for COVID-19 vaccines, in particular, but treatments also more generally. I guess you could say when you do the work, then you can show that that work has been done. And so, I believe that there were tremendous efforts by industry and also, across the board from a multi-stakeholder perspective, regulators as well, helping to ensure that we do have much greater diversity in those trials that were done. And we can say that it was better. It was not, perfect, right? We still didn't have, sort of a one-to-one representation of the diversity of populations here in the US, but in other regions as well. However, we made great strides. And for that, we could actually show that there was diversity in the populations. And obviously that helps, when you are transparent, it helps instill confidence among some of those populations that maybe are vaccine hesitant or in general just have a mistrust of how the medical community treats and involves or does not involve many of these populations that, again, are historically underrepresented in trials or just mistreated in general. So I believe that that because the work was done, again, just to reiterate, because there was relative success there, we were able to then be transparent about it in a way that did instill confidence.
Thank you so much. Haniyeh?
So, the way that the trials, whether if it's clinical trials or a vaccine trial that was conducted in the past, the objective was always recruiting and enrolling certain number of people, measuring the side effects, understanding the impact of it, and at the end, really measuring in evaluating whether if there is a minimum or a desirable performance from the treatment. And in these type of trials, enforcing diversity was always assumed to result in slowing down the trials. However, we saw that with COVID-19 trials, it actually showed us the contrast. It showed us how wrong we are thinking that diversity and enforcing diversity would result in a longer trial period. We were able to have more diversity in our trials, and we were able to finish the trials with high efficacy in a shorter period of time. And that really helped the federal response to providing the vaccines to the public.
Thank you. And before I ask the next panelist to respond, I want to invite the audience to submit your questions for this amazing panelist. So Carolyn, your response?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Irene. I would just want to, again, first start by thanking the volunteers out there who participated and raised their hand, and the healthcare providers who all participated in the trials that led to the availability today of several vaccines and therapeutics, and hopefully more on the way, to fight this pandemic. I think I might go in a little bit of a different direction, just real briefly, in that as great as the achievements were in this past year, what we learned, I think, about this pandemic is the weaknesses in our healthcare infrastructure overall, and our ability to respond and to reach hard to reach communities. So I think that there is still much more work to be done now that the hard work is kind of completed from the research side, but the shots in arms, getting over vaccine hesitancy, educating, those communities, that's our next hurdle, which we are continue to be a part of. We're also really encouraged to see this new administration's interest in addressing health disparities more broadly and overall. And so, in terms of the federal response, we look forward to continued collaborations and dialogue with this administration at the federal level, and also with state and local officials.
Thank you, Carolyn. LaTasha?
Thank you. Like Carolyn mentioned, there are a number of gaps that this pandemic has highlighted. We know that discrimination and bias in the healthcare system really has contributed to the pandemic's dramatic impact on communities of color. And we know that these communities have faced disproportionate numbers of cases, hospitalizations, and deaths, whether it was due to documented barriers to testing and treatment, or other perceptions in those communities. And while we know that minority and at-risk populations have historically been underrepresented in research, I do applaud the work of many organizations and sponsors and federal partners who really strove to ensure that diverse communities were involved in the clinical trials for vaccines, the monoclonal antibodies, and the therapeutics during this pandemic. But it really has highlighted the importance of community, the importance of access to care, the access to therapeutics. Our president and CEO, Dr. Gary Puckrin, really highlights that while we've done great things to really utilize the EUAs, or emergency use authorizations, to get these vaccines and therapeutics out there, the dissemination to communities of color has been a bit lacking. And I think that a lot of that has to do with access, awareness, and education in communities. And I think that, I believe it was Carolyn or maybe one of the other panelists mentioned that the concordance of provider to patient is important. We know that that oftentimes the racial, ethnic background, the cultural experiences really do reflect in the care outcomes, et cetera, that those communities face. And so from our work at NMQF, we've seen a shift in perceptions when that voice is a trusted voice. And I think that our federal partners should be applauded by beginning to adapt and utilize those local voices to really share messages and share concerns and really explanations to communities who have, some challenges with whether it's a vaccine or therapeutics or even the virus and their understanding of it.
Thank you, LaTasha.
Thank you.
Ellen?
So for the findings showing that vaccine safety and efficacy were similar for people of color and white participants could help increase the confidence in willingness to get vaccines. And as the other panels have noted, a lot of efforts have gone in to ensure that, so that we can make sure that the safety and efficacy for people of color could be an important component for that outreach. We have the information for that, and then also to have that available for educational campaigns and the actual vaccine efforts and in order to prevent the disparities in the actual access to the vaccines. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ellen, I'm just going to stay with you on answering our next question. How has the COVID-19 pandemic changed the way the medical community views diversity in research?
I think as Caroline and LaTasha have noted, the pandemic has really heightened and brought to the forefront in a very public way the issues of racial injustice, health inequities, and disparities in the US. Because COVID-19 had taken a heavy disproportionate toll on people of color, scientists have indicated that the vaccine trials should overrepresent people of color compared to their population share. So there has been specific efforts focused on diversity of COVID-19 vaccine trials, in addition to, in June last year, the FDA offering non-binding recommendations to the industry on development and licensure of COVID-19 vaccines that strongly encouraged, quote, the enrollment of populations most affected by COVID-19, specifically racial and ethnic minorities, unquote. So there has also been efforts on the community side, as LaTasha was noting. For example, historically, Black colleges and universities were participating on COVID-19 vaccine trials and encouraging participation among their communities. So finally, although people of color remain underrepresented in clinical trials for the 2 initial COVID-19 vaccines, compared to their share of population, these trials are more diverse than some trials have been historically. It does show that the possibility of improving diversity in clinical trials participation and also highlight the work that still remains. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Behtash?
Sure. And of course, Ellen's point is very poignant. There's if there wasn't before, there's an even greater recognition of the importance of diversity. And I would say, even more so, I think we've reached a point, again, due to COVID-19 and due to a lot of the other unfortunate and tragic social injustices that we've seen, more so over the last few years, the role of individuals and organizations in improving diversity and improving, how diverse populations are treated. Not necessarily medically, but also just how they are involved and included and provided access. One example is the definition of health literacy has just recently been amended. Previously, it focused entirely on an individual's capacity to access, understand, and utilize information to make health-related decisions. And now there has been a entirely separate and second component added, which is essentially the organizational onus, an organization's ability and work to support individuals' health literacy. I think that reflects a change societally in the way that we view the responsibility in terms of taking care of populations. So I think, a lot of self-reflection has also taken place in terms of institutional practices, practices in healthcare facilities to, again, lower those barriers of access and also to address personal bias. I think, again, more and more folks are becoming cognizant of, even unconscious efforts that they may put forth, unconscious biases that they may have that continue to perpetuate the inequity that we see. So it's sort of that the argument between equality and equity, where equity is, as we just said, sort of overrepresentation in trials, but also putting in greater effort to ensure that we are not only achieving equality, but going above and beyond to help these populations that historically, societally, institutionally have been marginalized.
Thank you so much. Carolyn?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And I think, for better or for worse, we've all learned a lot about ourselves and our communities over this past year. I hope that the good that can have come out of, the events and this terrible virus that's taken over is that it's actually inspired and spurred the next generation of students to want to, be scientists and healthcare providers and take a look around and say, I can be that change. I'm in an underrepresented community, but I want to do something to change that. I hope that that has been something that can be a light at the end of this, again, terrible tragedy of taking a virus that has shut down the world. I hope that, what we've learned a lot, as we've talked about, is, again, it kind of took this pandemic to reopen maybe some past wounds of, vaccine hesitancy, that health literacy point of not understanding, why, everyone getting a vaccine is important for public health overall because of that mistrust. And so hopefully we've learned some very important lessons from this, and like I said, inspire the next generation of, scientists and healthcare providers to help us move forward into the next era, and hopefully never utter the word spike protein again.
Yeah, I'm with you, Carolyn. Haniyeh?
So I think we got two main takeaways from the COVID-19 pandemic. The first one was the urgent need for having a diverse trials, not necessarily only for COVID-19 vaccine, but in general for any medical and clinical trials that we are going to have in the future. And the second takeaway was, as I mentioned before, enforcing diversity in the trial is not at the cost of reducing the trial speed. We've seen that otherwise with COVID-19 vaccine. And in general, as I want to echo what Ellen said, that as much as we want to have the trial to represent the overall population and have more diversity, but also COVID-19 showed us that the pandemic disproportionately impacted minorities and people of color. So we really need to have, as scientists, including Dr. Fauci emphasized, we need to have our trials to over-represent the minorities to account for the impact that COVID had for them.
Thank you. LaTasha?
Thank you. I want to reemphasize what Haniyeh just said. I think far too often in the clinical trial space, we hear people saying that having diversity at the core of a clinical trial slows things down and costs more money. But this pandemic really highlighted that you can do it, and you can do it in a timely and cost-efficient way. Because this pandemic really has highlighted the staggering systemic health and social inequities that persist in communities of color in America today. I think it's not just this pandemic, but all of the racial and social issues that we faced in the last year and a half really has shown the deep-rooted disparities that exist in communities of color. And by exposing them, we really have come to a place where we have innovative and inclusive innovation. We have community outreach. There's been efforts around policy that really is helping us strive for an equitable future. And I think also science itself has advanced dramatically over the past year, with discoveries rolling out with breathtaking speed. People have used terms like space race and other things that have been used to describe the rapid development of many of the vaccines and therapeutics. And there's been, really impressive strides by scientists in developing diagnostic tools and testing capacity, and just our underlying, our fundamental understanding of this virus. But I also want to share the flip side. There are some challenges or fears that the pandemic has created in terms of diversity in research and science. And some fear that the pandemic may be a magnifier of inequality and inequity. In particular, in science, we've always struggled to reflect the diversity of the world and the country or the communities in which we live and serve. And I think because COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted these communities of color, many worry that it will prevent individuals from those communities from, finishing college or going to college, getting advanced degrees. In particular, when you think about some communities, it's often that COVID-19 has shifted the way education has occurred. And, some minority groups really are dependent on, scholarships and whether it's athletic or non-academic scholarships to take them to college. This pandemic really has shifted that. And so many fear that we may not see as much diversity in science because it's shifted the way education is taking place, and advanced degrees are really going to suffer possibly as a result due to changing, funding, et cetera. There's also fear, in terms of women in their representation in science, because many have sidelined or stepped aside to step their education and careers aside to really take on the childcare burdens during this pandemic, because many areas of the country still aren't back in school. And so those are some concerns, but it's kind of this double-edged sword. We've learned a lot, but we've also sacrificed a lot.
Okay. Thank you so much, LaTasha. Have a new question starting off with Behtash. Are there any challenges and solutions in ensuring that there is more Asian American representation within clinical trials?
Yes, certainly. We've talked about some of both the challenges and solutions here. The mistrust that there is in general, of medical care, of medical institutions, the mistreatments of the past that have taken place. And the need to recognize and not simply just sort of say, hey, don't worry, those things can't happen again. It needs to be recognized, and it needs to be appropriately explored with audiences. We've also talked about access, in particular the recruitment activities, working together with communities. That needs to be a central part of what we do. We also, talked about the fact that decentralized trials are part of the solution, but they're not a silver bullet. They themselves create barriers to access. But the two things that I think are critically important are the relationship that care providers have with clinical research, and that, of course, is connected to the relationship that not just members of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, but pretty much all communities, the relationship that they have with a doctor, whether they have a regular doctor, is first of all, the critical issue. Do they have that access to care? If they do, is that individual essentially the end all be all for them? Do they follow that individual's advice? And if so, is that individual, is that care provider, is that HCP really engaged in clinical research? And by engaged, I mean aware of it, well educated about it, receptive towards at least discussing the idea with their patients. This is a barrier that we know exists across many communities for folks that look at clinical research as a potential option for themselves. Subsequently then speak with their doctor, and that becomes a barrier where the doctor is not aware of it and doesn't want to engage in that conversation. So I think, and I think it was mentioned earlier, the importance of having diversity among those care providers. And certainly I hope that the next generation is part of that solution. And the last thing that I'll just touch on, which I mentioned briefly before, health literacy. We know that this is a critical issue. Health literacy is low globally, it's low regionally, it's low among particularly, the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities who have health disparities. And therefore, much work needs to be done there, again, to empower the individuals from an organizational perspective. Education is critically important in that. And clinical research literacy, which is a term, hopefully, that I didn't just coin myself. But, obviously, with low health literacy, you know that there's much lower clinical research literacy, not just awareness, but also a true understanding of the process of clinical research, the risks and benefits associated with clinical research generally. It is not ideal that a patient with a recent diagnosis or with a diagnosis that they have been trying to treat for many years, and essentially they don't have any options anymore. Those are not the ideal time points for a patient to begin to learn about clinical research, right? Ideally, they will have had that education well before the imperative need to take part in clinical research has presented itself. So that type of empowerment, that type of education needs to be provided for these communities in order for there to be greater representation in trials. And again, just another reminder, there's many different ways to be involved in trials. There's many different ways to be involved in research. You don't necessarily have to participate in trials to be an active part of the solution. And that goes, again, for researchers as well. You don't just have to recruit diverse audiences. You need to work with the community beyond recruitment, but also in the initial directions of your research and also the design of your trials.
Thank you so much. LaTasha?
So Behtash hit a number of really important points in his remarks. I think the clinical trial literacy is one that's really needed. And speaking to communities of color around clinical trials, that's a huge challenge. And I think that for the Asian and Pacific Islander community in particular, that's a challenge. Unlike certain communities, whether we're talking about the Black African American community or the Latinx community, they share a common language. The challenge in the Asian Pacific and Islander community is you're so diverse. There's so many languages, there's so many cultures, there's so many different considerations to think about. And so even though we have data that shows us that about 17% of the healthcare workforce is of Asian American descent, what Asian American descent are they from? Is there concordance around specific care providers and the patients that they serve? Because oftentimes it's specific communities that are represented in that data, and it's important to really understand that. And so I know many of us know that research has shown that cultural and language barriers contribute to lower willingness to participate in health research, especially in the Asian American population. But to understand that even further, you've got to really dissect that out to understand what are those particular communities. And it varies by disease state, it varies by location, it varies by a number of factors. And so the lack of a diverse healthcare workforce can contribute to these challenges. I think also we need to really look at further investment in communities of color, especially Asian community. There was a cross-sectional, it looks like I have poor connectivity. I hope everyone can still hear me, even though you may not be able to see me. Okay, but there was a study that was conducted in 2019, and it really looked at around 500 or so clinical research projects that were focused on Asian American communities, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities that were funded by the NIH between approximately a 20-year period. And at that time, it comprised about 0.17% of the total NIH population. And when they compared that to a time period before, it had only increased by 0.06 percentage points over a 10-year period. So those findings really do highlight that we need more direction funding from federal organizations and entities that provide dedicated funding for health disparities research and parallel these efforts with the increased diversity of the biomedical workforce, as well as investments that can contribute to understanding of diversity and need for diversity in these unique populations. Thank you.
Thank you, LaTasha. Ellen?
Recruiting study participants are generally challenging across all populations. And adding to that, as Congressman Ami Bera had noted, and echoing what LaTasha had just said, Asian Americans are not a monolithic community. So for Asian Americans, there are also linguistic, religious, economic, and cultural barriers, or access-related barriers such as lack of access to nearby clinical trial sites or having comorbidities that excludes them from participation. We also see that from referral access. Some physicians that are not part of clinical trials may also be reluctant to refer their patients to clinical trial sites because it may mean that those patients will be receiving care at a different practice. So in terms of solution, as an industry sponsor, as Biogen, we would aim to, one, build enduring trust and relationship in the community, and two, help establish diversity as key scientific variable across our research portfolio, and three, meet patients where they are. So we will look to leverage real-world data and support of trusted organizations to bring our trials into the communities where we know are underrepresented, recognizing that this may require training new investigators who have diverse staff who represent the community that they serve, and also recognizing that this would require company commitment. And so lastly, we could also use the support of the medical community. So prescribers to talk to their patients about clinical trials and also to look into becoming clinical trial investigators themselves. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. I'm going to stop here and we're going to answer a question that we got from the audience. And so I'll just ask you to just sort of wave your hand if you want to answer this, or all of you can answer it. The question is, has the COVID-19 pandemic affected the distribution of medical supplies, prescription medications to APIs from a provider standpoint? Give me a moment to think. And anyone want to try to answer that one?
It's a great question. I can't speak to the AAPI perspective, but NMQF, when we did survey minority physicians during this pandemic and asked about testing, the access to testing and diagnostics, very early on in the pandemic, it was a bit limited. So I imagine that that was also true for the AAPI community.
Thank you. The pharmacists in our groups.
Yeah, I agree with LaTasha. I haven't seen AAPI specific data necessarily, but I think I concur with LaTasha's observations that I think early on there was a lot of concern. There was also just a scramble and just a lot of miscommunication, jumbled communication kind of coming out and trying to figure out how to prioritize groups or tier groups. And again, I think as we kind of said earlier on, we learned a lot in terms of pandemic response and the inequitable access to testing and other supplies. So I don't know, if it seems like there may have been similar experiences across other minority communities of color. So I don't really have good data on AAPI, but again, the good news is now with the availability of the vaccine, you can pretty much walk up to any pharmacy, grocery store, community health center, and there is the availability both for testing and vaccines today. So I think thankfully we are over that period of some difficulty there.
I'm so sorry about that. So I'm going to take another audience question, which is, what types of data do your respective organizations collect in regards to APIs in providing health equity measures?
DataRobot. So for DataRobot, the data that we used both was the information that was available through CDC, as well as the census information, the information that we have around demographic information for any geolocation at the census data. We had information around socioeconomic elements of a geography. So we kind of combine all these different sources of data and other public data sources that were available at the time for us.
And then while NMQF doesn't have any AAPI specific data, one thing that we launched and I encourage everyone to check out is a COVID-19 index. And we feel it's a powerful new tool that can be utilized to predict COVID-19 trends. It gives you like a 30-day lookout, but you can also go back historically. And you can also contact us. We have not included racial and ethnic because it is a predictive tool. But through some of our other indices, we're able to tell you specific geographies where large minority populations live. For example, in the African American community, we know that they live only in a large majority live only in 1,200 zip codes in the United States. And we can probably decipher that down also for the AAPI community as well, and understand where COVID is hitting the AAPI community the hardest. But for those of you interested, you can visit COVID, so covid.nmqf.us to play around with our COVID index. It's kind of like a weather forecast for upcoming pandemic storms.
Well, let's hope that that index goes way down. And
the numbers,
yes.
There's some hot spots.
Yeah, I'm sure there are. Anybody else want to answer that question?
I'll just jump in really quickly. Again, from pharma standpoint, we don't collect data necessarily, but from a policy standpoint, I think that that's a great question moving forward when we talk about how do we really start to infuse health equity across all that we do, including provider measures and accountability. We certainly are advocating for greater data and stratification across the data and measures that are collected by groups such as CMS when they're looking at how to devise payment programs. So we believe that measures around how providers are addressing health equity are important for the future as we build a more sustainable healthcare workforce and system. So great question.
Thank you to our audience for that great question. So I think we're going to wrap up now. I'm going to ask all of our panelists to make a closing remarks or statement. So let me start off with Behtash.
Thank you, Irene. And you did give me the heads up that I would start the closing statement. So I'll just answer the previous question. CISCRP has a biannual public and patient survey that we do. It does collect global data. Typically, we have between 12,000 to 15,000 respondents. And that data is looking at the perception and insights of those populations of clinical research, and also, their typical actions in terms of where do they go to get information, who do they trust if they were in clinical trials, what were their experiences. So we do publish reports that are publicly available on that. We do have a couple of publications and webinars on that too. So if you just go to the Googles and look for CISCRP perception and insights, you should find some interesting data there. And you can always feel free to reach out so that we can provide some stratified population-specific data. And we will have the new survey coming out here soon. But as far as a closing statement, I think, again, I really appreciate the opportunity to take part in this panel. It's been a pleasure to hear from everybody, and certainly the expertise, I think, provides an excellent view and gives incredible insights on what has been going on and hopefully what can continue to be improved. One topic here was publication, and I think that's the last thing that I'll just mention is there still is a great need for this information that we find from trials to be put out there. It's not done enough, and there's multiple purposes there. It's to instill trust by saying, here's everything that we've learned, you put it out there. It's also to help with patient care, so you need to make it understandable for them. But then again, it's also to inform other research and to ensure that we have efficiency and not duplicity in the work that we're doing. So I think that was part of this panel and something that I think should not be lost on us. So thank you again, and hopefully I get to connect with all of you again soon.
Thank you so much. And now I'll ask Carolyn to make some closing remarks.
Sure, thank you. And maybe I'll jump off from the last question, which was, we covered a lot of the challenges, but I think a really important solution is even just bringing all of us here together today and, being able to share our experiences, being able to use our voices, as, those who are health policy nerds and data nerds and healthcare providers to really come together and collectively brainstorm, where we can go from here. So, in terms of closing remarks, pharma and the biopharmaceutical industry is committed to addressing health equities. This is not just a one and done. It was not because, COVID hit and, we've had a lot of social unrest over the past year. We are really making a long-term investment as a trade organization. Again, as I've said, the clinical trial diversity principles are starting off point. They're really health equity more broadly as a pillar in our long-term patient-centered policy agenda, and it will be infused in everything that we do and stand for moving forward. So again, I think as we've shared a little bit of what we've done, it's also building a more inclusive workforce within the biopharmaceutical industry. As we talked about, we need scientists to look like the patients that are in their communities that they're outreaching to. So this has been a tremendous opportunity for us to be able to share what we're doing, and I encourage folks to follow all of our progress at pharma.org/equity, where you can learn about everything that we are doing to address diversity and equity across the biopharmaceutical ecosystem, as well as the U.S. population more broadly.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Ellen?
I also want to take the opportunity to thank APACS for the opportunity to be on this panel again, and also thank my fellow panelists for this interesting discussion and sharing of ideas. Within Biogen, while we are proud of the work we have done to improve diversity in clinical trials, we also know that there are more to be done. So this is both inside and outside the US, where there are many health disparities that go beyond race and ethnicity. And we do plan to leverage the learnings from diversifying our clinical trials in the US to help us better understand the issues in other countries across the globe, followed by a targeted action plan. We are committed to help close that disparity gap in clinical trials and ultimately access to healthcare. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Haniyeh?
So it was a great honor to be among the kind of distinguished panelists that we have in this talk. And I just want to point out that, we discussed so many different aspects of the pandemic and in general, the clinical trials when it comes to diversity. And, we talked about how COVID showed us things that we need to improve on, the urgency for a diverse trial. But we also had some success there. We were able to have some processes in place that helps us have these trials to be more diverse as well as be faster in the process. So we kind of need to bring that. And we also had a lot of collaboration, both from private artificial intelligence and machine learning community with the pharmaceutical aspect and with CDC to kind of really unite and help curb the pandemic and have a vaccine ready for the public. So we need to really leverage the knowledge, the insight that we gained through this pandemic and use it for the future to both improve our systems and also innovate for that.
Thank you so much. And then last but not least, LaTasha?
So in my closing, I really want to thank APEX for inviting me and you, Irene, for moderating this amazing session. And lastly, to my peers for sharing their insights. I want to highlight that a week from today is Clinical Trials Awareness Day, and it is celebrated around the world to recognize the day that James Lind started what is considered the very first randomized clinical trial aboard a ship on May 20th of 1747. And so it's really a well-deserved time to really recognize those individuals who participate in clinical trials and dedicate their time, lives, in their welfare sometimes, and to say thanks for what all those in the clinical research space do every day to improve public health. It really is, a celebration, and I think it's an opportunity to really raise the importance of clinical trial participation, especially among communities of color. And I also really want to highlight that today all of the panelists shared both challenges and solutions that will help develop and deliver more effective medications to diminish minority disparities and help to really achieve a more overall public health benefit. And in order for us to really close that clinical trial diversity gap, we need more organizations, we need more pharma partners, we need more public agencies to fund, support, and really raise awareness around initiatives like those highlighted today, so that increasing minority participation in clinical trials can be the top priority of one of our healthcare system's goals moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, LaTasha. I think it was great that we ended with you, because I did not know that it's Clinical Awareness Day. And, you all have been working in this area for a long time, and there really hasn't been the attention on clinical trials and its importance. And then, of course, publications that Behtash talked about. But for the COVID pandemic, I think if you talk about a silver lining, that it did make us aware how important it is that when we develop these vaccines and treatments, that the clinical trials have to include people that look like us. So, with that, I want to thank Apex for holding this very important panel today, and for all the panelists for taking all the time that you had to prepare for this, and just really all that you're doing every day in your life to ensure that our system is equitable, and that we address health equity, and that we make sure that our clinical trials are diverse so we can treat people and provide cures that will save Americans' lives regardless of their background. So thank you all.
Thank you, Irene.
Thank you.